The stage road from Belhaven crossed 40 miles of nothing before it reached Cutter's Pass, and Clara Ashford had been sitting on a hard wooden bench for most of those 40 miles with her back straight and her hands folded in her lap, because that was the only thing left she had control over. She was 31 years old. She had 2 trunks, a leather satchel containing $43, and a packet of letters tied with kitchen twine, and a second-hand wool coat that had been mended at the left elbow twice. She also had, for the first time in 4 years, something she'd almost forgotten how to hold on to, something that felt dangerously close to hope. His name was Douglas Farwell. He owned 800 acres along the Sutter Creek Valley, raised cattle and a small apple orchard, and had written her 9 letters over the course of 7 months. Letters that were careful and honest, and occasionally even funny in the dry, self-deprecating way of a man who'd lived alone long enough to stop pretending. He'd lost his wife 3 winters prior. He wasn't looking for romance, he said. He was looking for a partner, someone steady, someone who could help him build something that would last. Clara had read those letters so many times that some of the pages were soft at the folds. She'd answered everyone. She'd told him the truth about herself, or most of it, that she was widowed, that her first husband had left her with debts she'd spent 2 years paying down, that she was a school teacher by training and a practical woman by nature. She did not tell him about the doctor's verdict from 4 years ago, the one delivered in a flat clinical voice that had rearranged the entire structure of her future, that she would not be able to carry children. She told herself she would tell Douglas in person, that it was the kind of conversation that deserved a face. The coach rolled to a stop at the edge of the Farwell property just before noon on a Tuesday in late October, and Clara stepped down into mud that sucked at her boots and looked around at a spread of land that was prettier than she'd imagined, the mountains rising white and severe to the north, a creek line threading silver through the golden grass. The house itself solid and freshly painted, a shade that might have been green or might have been blue depending on the light. There were men working near the fence line. 3 of them paused and looked at her. Douglas Farwell was standing on the porch. He was taller than she'd pictured him, lean and weathered, with the kind of face that had spent more time outdoors than in. He came down the steps and across the yard toward her, and for one moment Clara felt the whole impossible journey collapse into something manageable, something she might actually be able to carry. "Miss Ashford," he said, "Mr. Farwell." She put out her hand. "It's good to finally—" "I need to ask you something." He did not take her hand. His voice was flat and careful in a way that didn't match the voice she'd constructed from 9 months of letters. "I had a letter last week from a woman in Millerton who said she knew you." Clara went still. "She said you can't have children." His eyes moved over her face, not unkind exactly, but assessing, looking for something. "Is that true?" Behind her, she could hear the coach driver climbing back onto his seat. The men at the fence had stopped pretending to work. "It's true," she said. "I was going to tell you when I arrived. I wanted to tell you in person." Douglas Farwell looked at the ground for a moment. Then he looked back at her, and she saw it. The decision already made probably before she'd even stepped off the coach, maybe made the moment that letter arrived. "I can't marry a woman who can't give me children," he said. "I have a ranch to leave to somebody. I need heirs. I'm not trying to be cruel about it, but that's just the truth of my situation." "I understand your situation," Clara said, and she was surprised by how level her voice came out, how much steadier it sounded than she actually felt. "I also understood yours to be one of a man who wanted a partner, someone steady, someone to help build something. I need both things. Then I'm sorry you only said one of them in your letters." She didn't cry. She would be proud of that later, in the way you're proud of small things when the larger ones have gone badly. She turned and asked the coach driver, who had not yet gotten the horses moving, whether he was returning to Belhaven that afternoon. He was. But the fare back was $2, which she could afford, but $2 was $2, and there was no guarantee of another position in Belhaven, and the next stage after this one wasn't until Thursday, and the sky to the north had been going an ugly gray-green color since morning. "You can stay in the barn tonight," Douglas Farwell said behind her. I don't want you stranded. The storm's coming in fast." She turned around. "Thank you," she said, "but I'll manage." She didn't know if that was true. She said it anyway. She paid the $2. She got back on the coach with her trunks and her satchel and $41 and the letters in her lap, and she rode back toward Belhaven for about 4 miles before the storm hit the mountains, with a sound like a door slamming in an empty house, and the road washed out in a ditch crossing, and the coach driver said he couldn't go any further. He was sorry, but he genuinely couldn't, and he had to turn back to the nearest shelter, which happened to be a trading post called Callaway's, and Clara was welcome to come inside, but there was no room for an overnight passenger, and he couldn't promise her anything past a dry corner and a cup of coffee. She stood outside Callaway's trading post in the beginning of what was turning into a genuine October mountain storm and tried to think clearly. The wind was already bad. The temperature had dropped maybe 15 degrees in the last hour. She had a coat and her trunks and $41, and she did not have a plan. There was a sycamore tree about 50 yards from the trading post, enormous and old, its bark the color of old bones, its branches stripped bare by the season. She walked to it because it offered something like shelter on the wind side, and she sat down on the roots with her back against the trunk, and she let herself feel it, all of it, just for a minute, just long enough to know what she was actually dealing with. The humiliation of it. The particular specific humiliation of having traveled 40 miles in a stagecoach in October in good faith and been turned away in front of strangers for a thing she couldn't change and hadn't chosen. The exhaustion under that, the kind that went bone deep and had been there longer than she wanted to admit. The grief that was underneath even that, because it wasn't only Douglas Farwell she was mourning. It was the version of the future she'd been carrying for 7 months, the one she'd built letter by letter out of something careful and hopeful and real. She sat under the sycamore tree and let herself feel all of it, and then she did the only practical thing she could think of. She went back into Callaway's and asked the man behind the counter if anyone in the area was hiring. The man's name was Gus Calloway. He was somewhere between 55 and ancient, with a beard that suggested he'd stopped making decisions about it years ago, and a general air of someone who'd seen most things and been surprised by very few of them. "Hiring what?" he said. "A teacher, a housekeeper, a cook, if it comes to that. I'm not particular about the category." Gus Calloway looked at her for a long moment. He had the slow, measuring quality of someone who spent a lot of time alone and had learned to read people carefully as a result. "You're the woman who came for Farwell," he said. It wasn't a question. "I was," she said. "I'm not anymore. Storm's going to be bad tonight." "I'm aware of that." He poured her a cup of coffee without being asked and set it on the counter. "My wife's cousin has a place up the mountain, Mercer Homestead. He's been looking for somebody to help with the household. He's got 9 children, and he's been doing it alone for about 2 years. I don't know that it's exactly what you're looking for." 9 children, Clara said. "Yes, ma'am." "How old is the oldest?" 16, I think. Girl named Hannah. She's the one mostly keeping the younger ones alive, from what I understand." Clara drank the coffee. Outside, the storm was picking up, and the light through the trading post's one window had gone the particular flat gray of incoming weather. She thought about $41 and no position and a road that was already washing out. "Is there a way to get up the mountain in this weather?" she asked. "Not tonight," Gus said, "but I've got a back room with a cot. You're welcome to it." She slept that night on a cot behind a shelf of dry goods with the sound of the storm working itself out against the roof, and she dreamed of nothing, which was almost a relief. She met Elias Mercer by accident, the way most consequential things happen. The storm broke sometime before dawn, and by mid-morning the sky was the hard, bright blue that comes after a mountain storm, cleaned out and cold and startlingly clear. Clara was helping Gus restack some crates that had shifted in the night when the door opened and a man came in, stamping mud off his boots. He was, she thought, probably 40, though he looked like 40-something had been working him hard, big through the shoulders in the way of someone who'd been doing physical labor since adolescence, dark hair going gray at the temples, a beard that hadn't been fully tended in a while but wasn't neglected either, just the beard of someone who had other priorities. He was wearing a coat that was warm and practical and had been repaired at the collar with what appeared to be a slightly wrong color of thread. He nodded at Gus and then looked at Clara with a kind of direct, unassuming attention that she wasn't used to. Not appraising exactly, just present. "This is Miss Ashford," Gus said. "She's looking for a position. I told her you might need some help up at your place." Elias Mercer looked at Clara. Clara looked at Elias Mercer. What kind of help? He said. Household management? Teaching, if your children need it? Cooking? She paused. I'm told you have 9 of them. I do. Something moved across his face that might have been exhaustion or might have been something more complicated than that. It's honest work, but it's not easy work. They're good kids, but there's a lot of them, and the oldest 2, Hannah, and the boy, Thomas, he's 14. They've been carrying more than they should. I'm not looking for somebody to tell me what I'm doing wrong. I'm looking for somebody who can just help. I'm not in the habit of telling people what they're doing wrong, Clara said. I found it's generally not well received. He almost smiled at that. It was a small thing, barely there, but she caught it. The pay isn't much, he said. Room and board and what I can spare in coin, which isn't a great deal right now. The work is hard. The mountain's not easy country, especially heading into winter. He looked at her with that same direct, unornamented attention. I'm not going to lie to you about what you'd be walking into. I appreciate that, Clara said, and meant it more than he could have known. She left with him that morning, her trunks loaded into the back of his wagon, the bright post-storm sky above them, and the mountain road climbing steadily into a country that was more beautiful and more severe than anything she'd imagined. They didn't talk much on the ride up. Elias drove with the focused economy of someone who'd done this road in every kind of weather, and Clara sat beside him and watched the landscape and thought about what exactly she was doing. She was being practical, she told herself. She was making a reasonable decision under difficult circumstances. She was not, under any circumstances, running towards something just because she'd been running away from something else. The Mercer homestead revealed itself around the last bend in the road. A main house, solid and unlovely in the way of structures built for survival rather than appearance, with a barn and 2 outbuildings and a vegetable garden that had been stripped down by the season into bare brown earth and a few remaining late-season squash. A creek ran along the eastern edge of the property, and there was a stand of aspen on the hill behind the house, their leaves gone but their white trunks bright in the cold sunlight. It was not, in the objective measure of things, a beautiful property, but it was alive in some way Clara couldn't immediately name. The chickens moving through the yard, the smoke rising from the chimney, the sound of voices from inside the house cutting off suddenly as the wagon came to a stop. The door opened. A girl appeared in the doorway, 16 years old, tall and angular, with her father's dark coloring and an expression of absolute wariness aimed directly at Clara. Behind her, Clara could see smaller faces pressing around her sides, a whole shelf of them in descending order. This is Hannah, Elias said. Hannah, this is Miss Ashford. She's come to help. Hannah Mercer looked at Clara the way a person looks at something they've been burned by before and aren't sure yet whether to trust again. Help with what? She said. With everything, Clara said. If you'll let me. The first week was the hardest. Not because of the children. The children, it turned out, were not the problem. The problem was the sheer weight of accumulated disorganization that comes from a large household being managed by 2 exhausted teenagers and a father who was doing his absolute best, and his absolute best was not, through no fault of his own, sufficient. There were 9 children, Hannah at 16, Thomas at 14, then Ruth and James, who were 12 and 11, and Irish twins in all but name, then 4 more spaced down to little Cora at 4 years old, and then the baby, Michael, who was 18 months and had apparently been raised largely by committee. Clara did not try to fix everything at once because she'd learned, from 4 years of teaching other people's children, that trying to fix everything at once was the surest way to fix nothing. She started with what was immediate, food that was adequate rather than just possible, a schedule for the mornings that didn't require Hannah to wake at 4 in the morning to get everyone fed before Thomas took the older children down the mountain for school, a system for the laundry that didn't require any single person to spend an entire day at the washboard. Hannah watched all of this with the sustained suspicion of someone waiting for the moment when it would all prove to be something other than what it looked like. "How long are you staying?" she asked Clara on the 3rd evening while they were washing up after supper. "I don't know," Clara said honestly. "Papa pays you?" "A little. And room and board." Hannah was quiet for a moment. She had her mother's hands, Clara thought. She didn't know how she knew that, but it felt true. Long-fingered and capable. "We've had other women come," Hannah said. 3 of them since Mama died. None of them stayed past 2 months. "What made them leave?" Hannah looked at her with those careful dark eyes. "It's hard up here," she said. "The winters are long. There's a lot of work and not much company. The road down is bad half the year." She paused. "And there were things people said. Down in the valley. About Papa. About the situation. Not everyone thinks it's appropriate. A woman up here alone with a man who isn't her husband." Clara kept washing the pot she was washing. "People talk," she said. "Does that bother you?" She thought about Douglas Farwell's porch. She thought about the men at the fence line who'd stopped pretending to work. "Not as much as it used to," she said. By the end of the second week, certain things had shifted in the way that things shift in households. Not dramatically, not all at once, but visibly enough to track. Michael had stopped crying every time Clara came near him. Ruth had started saving her arithmetic problems to show Clara at supper. James had, unbidden, begun splitting the morning wood without being asked, which Elias told her quietly was something he'd been refusing to do for 4 months. Thomas was the hardest. Thomas was 14 years old and the man of the house in his own mind, which was both understandable and exhausting. And he treated Claire with a careful, formal politeness that was really just suspicion in a dress coat. She didn't push him. She let him help her understand the livestock and asked him questions she genuinely didn't know the answers to, and she did not, under any circumstances, try to be his mother. She was careful about that with all of them. She was not their mother. She was not trying to be. She was someone who was here, who was useful, who found that she liked them. Their specific individual selves, the way Ruth laughed too loud at her own jokes, the way little Cora had taken to following Clara around the house, at a distance of exactly 2 feet like a small, serious shadow. Elias, for his part, was careful too, in his own way. He was not a complicated man, or rather he was not a man who expressed his complexity in words. He expressed it in the things he did, the quiet ways he made room for her, the fact that he came in early on the evenings when she had fallen behind with the dinner so that he could watch the younger children without being asked. He asked her questions about herself carefully, in the way of someone who was genuinely curious and also genuinely aware that there were things she might not want to talk about. She told him one evening about Douglas Farwell. Not all of it, but enough. He listened without commenting until she was done. "That was a cowardly thing he did," he said. "Doing it in front of people. He thought it was honest. Honest and cowardly aren't mutually exclusive." Clara looked at him. It was an unexpectedly precise thing to say. "No," she agreed. "They're not." There was a silence that was not uncomfortable. Outside, the wind was moving through the aspen stand, and the sound was like water, like something alive. "My wife," Elias said after a while. "She died of fever 2 winters ago. It was fast. Faster than—" He stopped. The kids didn't get a chance to say goodbye. I didn't either. He was looking at the fire. "I'm not telling you this for any particular reason. I think sometimes it helps, knowing what people have been carrying." "I think so too," Clara said. She did not tell him that evening about the doctor's verdict. That conversation would come, she thought, but it was not ready yet. And she was learning, slowly, at 31, which was possibly later than she should have learned it, that not every truth needed to be said in the first moment you felt it pressing against the inside of your chest. It was Hannah who finally broke. It happened on a Sunday morning in the 3rd week, when the younger children were outside and Elias was in the barn, and it was just the 2 of them in the kitchen, Hannah washing, Clara drying, and Hannah dropped a pot and caught it before it hit the floor. But the noise startled little Cora, who'd been in the next room, and Cora started crying, and Hannah put the pot down very carefully on the counter and pressed her hands flat against the wood, and her shoulders started to shake. Clara set down her dishcloth. She didn't say anything. She moved to stand near Hannah, not touching her, just near. Close enough that Hannah could feel she was there. "I'm so tired," Hannah said. Her voice was muffled. She wasn't crying loudly. She was crying in the contained, almost silent way of someone who'd learned not to do it where people could hear. "I have been so tired for so long, and I can't—" She stopped. "I know," Clara said. "You don't know." But it wasn't unkind. "No," Clara agreed. "Not exactly, but I know what it's like to be the one who keeps things together when they'd rather fall apart." Hannah turned around. Her face was splotched and young and exhausted, and for a moment she looked exactly her age, which was 16, and which was far too young to have been carrying what she'd been carrying. "She's not coming back," Hannah said. "I know that. I do know that. But sometimes She stopped again. "I used to think if I just kept going, if I kept everything together long enough, it would start to feel normal. And it doesn't. It still doesn't." "Maybe it's not supposed to feel normal yet," Clara said. "Maybe you've just been trying too hard to make it look like it does." Hannah looked at her for a long moment. Then she sat down at the kitchen table and put her head in her hands. And Clara sat down across from her and didn't try to fix it, didn't reach for the practical thing to say. Just sat there in the cold morning kitchen while little Cora came in from the next room and climbed into her sister's lap, and Hannah held her, and the three of them sat together in the quiet. Outside, through the window, the mountains held the morning light, white and severe and indifferent and enormous, and the aspen stand shivered in the wind, and the smoke from the chimney went straight up into an absolutely clear November sky. Clara sat in the kitchen of a house she hadn't known existed 6 weeks ago and felt, for the first time in longer than she could precisely locate, something she was very careful not to name too quickly. She was not going to call it home. Not yet. It was too soon and too fragile, and she'd made that mistake before. The mistake of naming a thing before it was ready to hold the name. But it was something. It was real. It was warm in a way that had nothing to do with the fire. She let herself have that much, and nothing more. And she began to plan for the long winter ahead. Winter came to the Mercer homestead the way it always did in that country. Not gradually, not with warning, but all at once, like a decision that had already been made somewhere up in the high peaks and was only now being delivered to the rest of the world. The first real snow fell on a Wednesday in late November, and by Thursday morning it was 18 inches deep and still coming, and Clara stood at the kitchen window before dawn with a cup of coffee going cold in her hands, and looked at the world that had been entirely rearranged overnight and thought, well, here you are then. She'd been at the Mercer homestead for just over a month. She had not, as she'd originally told herself she might, left after a few days. She had also not, as she sometimes reminded herself in the quiet moments before sleep, made any kind of permanent decision. She was here. She was useful. That was enough for now. The children adapted to her presence the way children adapt to most things, unevenly, at their own pace, on their own terms. Little Cora had fully abandoned any pretense of reserve and now treated Clara as a fixed feature of the household, the same way she treated the wood stove and the rocking chair near the fire. Michael, the baby, had started raising his arms to be picked up when Clara came into a room, which did something to her chest she was not going to examine too closely. Ruth brought her arithmetic problems, and then, as December settled in, began bringing her other things, drawings, questions, a dead bird she'd found near the tree line that she wanted to understand. "Why do things die?" Ruth asked, standing at the kitchen table with the small frozen bird cupped in both hands, looking at it with the specific focused grief of an 11-year-old encountering mortality as a concept rather than an event. Clara looked at the bird. "I don't know exactly," she said. "In this case, probably the cold." "But why does the cold kill things? Because they're not built for it, or because they run out of what they need to keep going?" Ruth turned the bird over carefully. "That seems unfair." "It is," Clara said. "Most of the time, it genuinely is." Ruth looked up at her. "Miss Ashford, did you ever have a bird?" "I had a cat when I was young. Her name was Persimmon." Ruth considered this. "That's a strange name for a cat." She was a strange cat. They buried the bird together behind the barn, in the frozen ground, which took some effort with a small pickaxe and a determination that Clara suspected was about more than the bird. Ruth didn't cry. She was very serious about the whole thing, and when it was done, she stood with her arms at her sides and her face turned up into the gray winter sky and said, "I think that's right." And then she went back inside. Thomas watched all of this from the barn doorway. He didn't say anything, but later that afternoon he brought Clara an armful of firewood without being asked, which he set down beside the stove with a thump and then left without comment, and Clara understood that this was, from Thomas, something close to a declaration. Elias noticed all of it. She was aware of him noticing, in the peripheral way you're aware of something you're not looking directly at. He was not a man who expressed things easily in words, but he expressed them in other ways. in the fact that he started coming in from the barn earlier on the evenings when she was managing the supper, and 3 of the younger children simultaneously. In the way he repaired the latch on the door to her room without being asked, the one that hadn't been closing properly since she arrived. In the quiet, almost embarrassed way, he pushed an extra blanket onto the pile outside her door one night when the temperature dropped hard, with a note in his handwriting that said only, "Cold night coming." She kept the note. She didn't examine why. December moved through the homestead the way time moves in isolated places. Slowly and completely, filling every corner of the days. Clara taught the 4 youngest children in the mornings when the road was too dangerous for the older ones to attempt the mountain to the schoolhouse in the valley. She had not set out to do this. It had happened organically, the way most of the things she did at the Mercer homestead happened. Because there was a need, and she was there, and it was the reasonable thing. 7-year-old Lily turned out to be startlingly quick with letters. 5-year-old Ben was the opposite, struggling with the shapes of them in a way that Clara recognized from years of teaching. Not a lack of intelligence, but a specific difficulty with the visual pattern of written language that some children simply had, and that required patience rather than repetition. She worked with him differently than the others, and he made slow, genuine progress. And the look on his face the morning he read his first complete sentence, 3 words, "A cat sat," was the kind of thing that made Clara remember why she'd become a teacher in the first place, before everything else had happened. She told Elias about Ben's progress at supper that evening. It was one of the nights when all 9 children were at the table, which made supper loud and chaotic in a way that had initially overwhelmed her and now just felt like noise she understood how to move through. "He's not slow," she said, keeping her voice down under the general commotion of 7-year-old Lily arguing with Thomas about something that appeared to involve a missing knife. "He just sees the letters differently. There are ways to work with that." Elias was listening. He had the quality of someone who gave his full attention when he decided to give it, which wasn't always, but when he did, you felt it. "His teacher in the valley told me he was behind," he said. "He is behind, but behind isn't the same as unable." She moved the butter toward him because his hands were full of managing Michael, who was sitting in his lap attempting to dismantle the salt cellar. "Give me another month with him." Elias looked at her across the table, across the noise and the argument about the knife and little Cora trying to feed a piece of bread to an imaginary something on the bench beside her. His expression was difficult to read, but there was something in it, something that she categorized quickly and set aside, because she was being careful, because she was always careful now. "All right," he said, "another month." It was after the first of the year that the trouble started. She'd almost expected it, in the abstract way you expect things you've been told to expect. Gus Calloway had warned her, gently, when she'd stopped at the trading post in mid-December for supplies. His wife's cousin Netta had said something, and one of the men from the Farwell Ranch had been down to Bellhaven asking questions, and the general conversation in the valley had apparently turned, at some point, to the subject of the woman up at the Mercer place. "People talk," Gus said, loading her supplies. "I wouldn't worry yourself too much." "I'm not worried," Clara said. "I'm practical." "What are they saying?" Gus had the grace to look slightly uncomfortable. "That Farwell turned you away and you latched on to the next available man. That Elias is, well, that he's not thinking clearly. That a woman in your position—" He stopped. "In my position," Clara said. "It's not what I think," Gus said. "I want to be clear about that." "I know." She paid for the supplies. "What's the name of the woman who wrote to Farwell, the one in Millerton who told him about my situation?" Gus's expression shifted into something more wary. "Why do you ask?" "Because I'd like to know who thought my private medical history was theirs to share." He was quiet for a moment. "Her name is Dorothea Vane. She's the wife of a businessman named Harlan Vane. He was acquainted with you, I think, before you came here." Clara was quiet for a long moment. The name settled into her chest like a stone into still water. "Yes," she said finally. "He was acquainted with me." She didn't say anything else about it. She loaded her supplies into the wagon and drove back up the mountain through the December cold. And she thought about Harlan Vane the whole way. And by the time she reached the homestead, she had the beginnings of something that was not quite fear and not quite anger, but was somewhere in the territory between them. She'd met Harlan Vane 3 years ago in Millerton, where she'd been teaching at the district school. He was a businessman of the kind that the Western Territories produced occasionally, successful in ways that didn't bear examination, confident in the specific way of men who'd never had a door closed in their face. He'd been charming, and she'd been recently widowed and cautious, and he'd pursued her with the patient, systematic attention of someone who'd decided he wanted something and was accustomed to getting it. She'd refused him, eventually, after 6 months of escalating pressure and one incident that she'd never told anyone about, not in so many words. She'd left Millerton shortly after. She'd thought that was the end of it. The letter to Douglas Farwell suggested it was not. She didn't tell Elias any of this, not yet. It was January, and the winter was serious, and the household had found its rhythm, and she was not going to disrupt that rhythm over something that might, she told herself, still come to nothing. The gossip from the valley arrived at the homestead through Thomas first, because Thomas was 14 and went down to the schoolhouse with the older children when the road allowed it, and 14-year-old boys hear things. He told his father about it on a Sunday evening, in the directness of a boy who didn't yet know how to soften things, or whether he should. Clara was in the next room. She could hear them through the wall. "They're saying she came here on purpose," Thomas said, after Farwell turned her down. "They're saying that she's after something." A silence. "What do you think?" Elias said. "I don't know. I mean, she's—" Another silence, longer. "She helped Ben with his reading. She spent 2 hours on it last week, just with him. That doesn't seem like something you do if you're after something." "No," Elias agreed. "It doesn't. But people are saying it, and Hannah heard some things too down at the dry goods store, about what kind of woman she is, for being here." Clara stood very still in the other room. She had her hands flat against the wall, and she could feel the cold coming through the wood. "Thomas," Elias said, "do you think the people saying those things know her?" "No." "Do you?" A pause. "A little, I guess." "Then you can make your own judgment." She heard Thomas move toward the door. Then he stopped. "Papa," he said, "what are you going to do?" "About what?" "About what people are saying about her being here." The silence this time was long enough that Clara started to breathe again. "Nothing," Elias said. "I'm going to do nothing, because there's nothing to do. She's here, she's doing good work, and what people say about that is their own business." She heard Thomas leave. She stood in the hallway for another moment, and then she went into the kitchen and started on the breakfast dishes from that morning that hadn't gotten done. And she was very focused and deliberate about the washing, the rinse, the drying, as if these ordinary things could hold the shape of the ordinary life she was trying, very carefully, to build. The conversation with Hannah happened differently. Hannah came to her room one evening in late January, knocked on the door frame because the door was open, stood there with her arms crossed in the posture she adopted when she was feeling uncertain and trying not to show it. "Can I talk to you about something?" Hannah said. "Of course." Clara set down the mending she'd been working on. "Sit down." Hannah sat on the edge of the bed. She was quiet for a moment, looking at her hands. "Martha Yell told me something today," she said. "Martha's the daughter of the man who runs the lumber mill. She's in school with me. She said—" Hannah stopped. Started again. "She said her mother told her that the reason you came up here was because you're the kind of woman who goes where men are. That it's not right, you being here, with Papa." Clara looked at Hannah steadily. "What did you say to Martha Yell?" Hannah's jaw tightened. "I told her she didn't know what she was talking about." "Good." "But Clara." The use of her first name was new. Hannah had been using it for about 2 weeks, carefully, as if still testing the weight of it. Is any of it true? The things they're saying?" Clara thought about this. Not about what to say. She knew what to say. But about how much of the truth Hannah was ready to hear, and how much of it was actually hers to give. "I came here because Gus Calloway told me your father needed help, and I needed a position," she said. "That's the whole of it. What people say about that is what people say when they don't know someone well enough to have an opinion, but have one anyway. That's not really an answer." "No," Clara agreed. "It's not." She looked at the girl in front of her, 16 years old, serious and guarded, and carrying a weight that kept adding to itself. "The truth is that I don't have anywhere else to go. I don't mean that in the way it sounds. I mean, I was supposed to be in a different life right now. I had a plan and the plan didn't work, and I ended up here. And it turns out here is... She stopped. It turns out here is not what I expected. Is that good or bad? Clara looked at the mending in her hands. The shirt was Thomas's. She'd been replacing buttons that had come off, 3 of them, apparently all at once. I'm still figuring that out, she said. Hannah looked at her for a long moment. Then, quietly, she said something Clara wasn't expecting. My mother used to mend Thomas's shirts, she said. He loses buttons constantly. I don't know how. I've never figured it out. Clara looked at the shirt. I noticed, she said. There was a silence. It wasn't uncomfortable. I miss her, Hannah said. Just that plainly, without decoration. I know it's been 2 years. I know I'm supposed to be further along or whatever, but I miss her every single day. You don't have to be further along, Clara said. Missing someone doesn't have a schedule. Does it get easier? Clara thought about her husband, about the particular shape of grief that changes over time. Not smaller, exactly, but different, less sharp, more something you could carry. The shape of it changes, she said. It doesn't go away, but you get better at holding it. Hannah nodded slowly. She stood up to leave and then paused at the door. The shirt, she said. You don't have to do that. I can do it. I know you can, Clara said. But you're doing 6 other things. Let me do this one. Hannah looked at her for a moment. That careful measuring look that was so much her father's. And then she nodded and left. And Clara went back to the buttons, and outside the window the January dark was total, and the mountain held its cold, and the house was full of the sound of 9 children doing the ordinary things of evening. She finished the buttons. She folded the shirt. She set it on the chair by the door where Thomas would find it in the morning, and she sat for a while in the quiet of her room and let herself think about what it felt like to be here, in this place that was not hers, with these people who were not hers, building something that she did not yet have a name for. February brought a thaw, and then another freeze, and then a slow, grudging retreat of winter that suggested spring was possible but not committed. Elias began planning for the season's work, fencing that needed repair, the north pasture that needed clearing, decisions about the cattle that required more money than he had available, and therefore careful thinking. Clara found him at the kitchen table one evening with the ranch account spread in front of him and the expression of a man doing arithmetic that wasn't adding up. Can I look? She said. He glanced up. Why? Because I taught mathematics for 4 years, and I have a reasonable mind for numbers. He hesitated. Not, she thought, because he didn't want her to look, but because there's something particular about showing another person the shape of your finances, the way they reveal not just money, but decisions and failures, and the distance between where you are and where you'd meant to be. It's not impressive, he said. I'm not looking for impressive. He pushed the papers toward her. She sat down across from him and went through them. The columns of expenditure, the income from the cattle sales in autumn, the debts against the property that were smaller than she'd feared but present. This feed supplier, she said, pointing, you're paying 30% more than the going rate. He extends credit. Yes. But if you paid cash up front at the Belhaven supplier, you'd save enough in a season to cover the cost of the credit anyway. I don't have the cash up front. You might, by fall, if you structured the cattle sales differently. She traced through the numbers, thinking aloud more than presenting a case. You're selling the whole lot in October. If you split the sale, half in September, half in November, you spread the income and you can catch the price variation between seasons. Last year, November was higher. The year before, too. Elias was watching her in that way he had. That full attention way that she was starting to understand was simply how he engaged with things he found worth engaging with. Where did you learn that? He said. My husband ran a small operation before he died. I helped with the books. She looked up from the papers. I didn't just teach mathematics. I also lived with it. What else do you see? She went back to the papers. They sat together at the kitchen table for the better part of 2 hours. And outside the window, the February night was clear and cold, and the sky was enormous in the way that mountain skies are enormous, filled with stars that looked close enough to be a problem. And inside the house, the children were sleeping, and the fire was low, and it was very quiet. At some point, Clara became aware that the quality of the quiet had changed. She looked up from the papers and found Elias looking at her, not at the accounts, and there was something in his expression that was unguarded in a way he usually wasn't. "What?" she said. "Nothing." He looked back at the papers. "I was just thinking." About? About how it's been a while since someone sat at this table and thought about the future with me. He said it simply, without sentimentality or angle, the way he said most things. I'd forgotten what it felt like. Clara looked at him. She looked at the papers between them, the ranch accounts, the numbers that represented a life being built and sustained at significant effort, and she thought about what she was and was not prepared to say. "It's a good life you're building here," she said. "It's worth the trouble." "Most days I think so." He gathered the papers into a stack. "Some days I'm not sure." "Which kind of day is today?" He almost smiled. "Better than most," he said. She went to bed that night and lay in the dark for a long time before sleeping, listening to the sound of the house breathing around her. The small noises of 9 children sleeping, the crack of the wood in the walls as the temperature dropped, the faint sound of the creak she could sometimes hear through her window when the night was still enough. She was not going to let herself want something she couldn't yet see clearly. She was not going to do that again. But she lay in the dark, and she thought about the ranch accounts, and the kitchen table, and the way Elias had said better than most. And she was honest enough with herself, alone in the dark, to admit that she was already further in than she'd intended to be. March arrived with mud and bird song, and the first pale green of new growth on the hillside, and with it came something Clara had been half expecting since December. A rider came up the mountain road on a Tuesday morning. A man she didn't recognize, well-dressed in the way of someone from money rather than work, on a horse too good for a casual trip up a mountain track. He asked at the house for Miss Clara Ashford. She came out onto the porch and looked at him. "I don't believe we've met," she said. "No, ma'am." He handed her an envelope. "I've been asked to deliver this." She took it. He left. She stood on the porch in the March mud and opened the envelope, and inside was a single sheet of paper with Harlan Vane's name printed at the top, and a message that was brief and precise and left very little room for interpretation. It informed her that Mr. Vane was in possession of certain documents pertaining to her previous employment in Millerton, and that he intended to share these documents with the relevant authorities and with the community of Cutter's Pass unless she made arrangements to meet with him at his earliest convenience to discuss the matter. She read it twice. She folded it. She put it in her coat pocket. She went back inside and helped Lily with her letters, and she put supper on, and she waited until the children were in bed and Elias was finishing his work in the barn, and then she sat down at the kitchen table and took the letter out of her pocket and read it a third time. When Elias came in, she was still sitting there. He looked at her face. He stopped with his coat half off. "What happened?" he said. She handed him the letter. He read it. He read it again. He set it down on the table between them. "Who is Harlan Vane?" he said. So she told him. All of it this time. The full version, the real version, including the part she'd been holding back, the courtship she hadn't wanted, the night that had frightened her enough to make her leave Millerton, the letter he'd apparently sent to Douglas Farwell, the fact that she didn't know exactly what documents he claimed to have or what they alleged, but that a man like Harlan Vane didn't need real documents to cause real damage. Elias listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "Why didn't you tell me this before?" he said. Not accusingly, genuinely asking. "Because I wasn't sure you'd want me here if you knew," she said. "And because I wasn't sure what was coming. I thought maybe if I kept my head down and didn't cause trouble, that's not how men like that work." "I know." She looked at her hands. "I know that. I've always known that." He was quiet again. She had learned to wait out his silences. He wasn't being withholding, he was thinking, and he thought before he spoke in a way that had become one of the things she most trusted about him. "All right," he said finally. "All right what?" "All right, we deal with it." He picked up the letter and looked at it again. "What does he actually have? Documents about your employment in Millerton? What is that likely to mean?" "He's a businessman. He has connections to the school board. My guess is he's fabricated some kind of professional complaint, something that would make it look like I left under a cloud. Can he prove it? He doesn't need to prove it. He needs to say it loudly enough that people believe it. Elias looked at her. There was something in his face that was very steady, very direct, that she found herself holding on to. I have contacts in Belhaven, he said. A lawyer named Horace Grint. He's done work for the ranch before. And Gus Calloway knows everyone in 2 counties. If there are people who know what Vane is actually like, we can find them. Elias, she stopped. This is going to bring trouble to your door. Whatever Vane has or claims to have, using it against me means using it against you by association. Against this household, against your children's reputation. He looked at her for a long time. Clara, he said, you have spent 4 months getting my children through the winter, teaching Ben how to read, fixing Thomas's shirts, and sitting at this table helping me figure out how to keep this ranch alive. If you think I'm going to hand you over to a man like that to protect my reputation, then you don't know me as well as I think you do. She looked at him across the kitchen table. She had not cried when Douglas Farwell turned her away in front of his men. She had held herself together through a mountain storm and a strange man's wagon and 9 strange children and 4 months of a life she hadn't planned. She felt very suddenly and unexpectedly like she might cry now. She didn't. She took a breath and looked at the letter on the table and thought about what came next. And beside her, the fire burned low and the house settled around them with the particular sound of a structure that had been standing a long time and intended to keep standing. And she let herself believe cautiously that she was not facing this alone. It was the most frightening thing she'd felt in years. And somehow, underneath the fear, it was also the truest. Horace Grint was a small man with large hands and the kind of face that had stopped being surprised by people a long time ago. He practiced law out of a narrow office above the Belhaven Grain Exchange, and he had, as Elias had said, done work for the Mercer Ranch before. Mostly the ordinary legal business of land and cattle, nothing complicated. He listened to Clara's account of Harlan Vane without interrupting, without writing anything down. And when she finished, he sat back in his chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment the way a man looks at something he's seen before and didn't enjoy the first time. Vane, he said. I know the name. He has a timber interest east of Millerton and something in banking, I think. He's well connected. I'm aware of that, Clara said. The letter doesn't specify the nature of these documents he claims to have. No, it doesn't. That's deliberate. Grint picked up the letter and read it again. Men like Vane don't threaten with specifics. Specifics can be disproved. Vagueness is harder to fight because you can't aim at it. He set the letter down. Tell me what he could plausibly claim about your time in Millerton. Clara had been expecting this. She had prepared herself for it, which didn't make it easier. He had connections to the school board, she said. 2 of the 3 members were men he did business with. If he wanted to, he could have gone to them after I left and said, anything, really. That I was dismissed for cause, that there were complaints from parents, that I left under circumstances that reflected badly on my character. Were there any complaints from parents? No, I left voluntarily. My record there was clean. Do you have documentation of that? A letter from the board? Records of your employment? She opened the satchel she'd brought and took out a folded envelope. My letter of reference from the board chairman, written when I left. And 2 letters from parents of students also written at the time. I kept them. Grint looked at the letters. Something shifted slightly in his expression, not quite impressed, but reassessing. You anticipated this, he said. I anticipated something, Clara said. I didn't know the shape of it, but I've been carrying these since Millerton. Elias, who had been sitting in the chair beside her and letting her do the talking, said, What's our position? Grint thought about it. Your position is defensible, he said, but defense is the wrong posture. If Vane makes public allegations, even false ones, the damage happens before the truth can catch up. You'd be spending the next year correcting a story instead of telling your own. He put the letters back in the envelope. The question is whether you can get ahead of him. What does that look like? Clara asked. It looks like knowing what he actually has before he uses it. And it looks like having people in this county who'll speak for you before he starts talking. Grint folded his hands on the desk. Do you know anyone in Millerton who might be willing to give a statement about the nature of his interest in you? Any witnesses to the incident you described? The incident. She told him about it carefully, in the flat, precise language she'd used when she'd rehearsed it to herself in the months after leaving. The evening at the Vane house. The dinner that had gone past polite. The moment when Harlan Vane had made the shape of his intentions unmistakably clear. And the scene that followed when she refused them. She'd left 2 days later. She'd told no one because she was a woman alone in a town where Harlan Vane was a prominent man, and she had calculated correctly that telling people would cost her more than leaving. There was a woman, Clara said slowly. His housekeeper. A woman named Ida Pressler. She was there that evening. She saw me leave. She paused. I don't know if she'd speak. She still works for him, as far as I know. Let me make some inquiries, Grint said. Don't respond to Vane's letter yet. Don't engage with him at all. And, he looked at Elias, be aware that whatever he does, he's likely to go to the community here first. Gossip travels faster than legal proceedings. It already has, Elias said. They drove back up the mountain in the early afternoon with the March sun making the snowmelt run in rivers along the road edges, and neither of them talking much. Clara sat with her satchel in her lap and watched the country rise around her, and thought about Ida Pressler, who she hadn't allowed herself to think about in 2 years. Ida had been maybe 60, small and efficient, with the quality of someone who had worked in other people's houses long enough to have learned how to be invisible. She had looked at Clara that evening with an expression that was impossible to read, sympathy or warning, or simply the practiced blankness of someone who had learned not to see things. Whether she would speak was genuinely unknowable. People in dependent positions made calculations about survival, not justice, and Clara couldn't blame them for it. You're thinking about something specific, Elias said. I'm thinking about whether Ida Pressler is going to help us. And I don't know. She watched the creek through the trees. I've been in positions where the right thing and the safe thing were different things. I didn't always choose the right one either. Elias was quiet. He drove for a minute, navigating a stretch where the road had washed partly out. Do you want to talk about what happened that night? He said. At his house. No, she said. Then, maybe, not today. Okay. That was all. He didn't press it, and she felt the not pressing like a kind of steadiness she could lean against without falling. It was 2 weeks before Vane moved, and the way he moved was not the way Clara had expected. She'd anticipated a legal filing, something formal that could be answered formally. What came instead was quieter and harder to defend against. It was a story, carried from person to person through the valley the way stories travel, gaining weight and specificity as it moved. By the time it reached Gus Calloway's trading post, it had acquired details it hadn't started with, that Clara Ashford had been dismissed from her position in Millerton for theft, that she had previous to Millerton been involved with a married man in another county, that she had come to Cutter's Pass deliberately, following a scheme she'd been running in one form or another for years. None of it was documented. None of it was sourced. It was just there suddenly, the way a smell is just there when something has gone bad, present and persistent, and difficult to locate precisely. Gus told Elias at the trading post on a Saturday in late March. He was apologetic about it in the way of a man delivering information he didn't create and wishes he didn't have. I'm not saying anyone believes it, Gus said. I'm saying it's being said. Who's saying it? Clara asked. She'd come with Elias this time, deliberately. Gus hesitated. It came through Douglas Farwell's men first, 2 of his hands talking at the feed store. He paused. I don't think Farwell invented it. I think he's passing along something that was given to him. By Vane, Clara said. That would be my guess. So it was 2 of them now. Vane with his money and his connections and his fabricated story, and Farwell with his wounded pride and his willingness to serve as a vessel for someone else's poison. The combination was not accidental. Vane would have found Farwell without difficulty. A man in the valley who had a grievance against Clara, who could be used to distribute a story without Vane's name being visibly attached to it. She thought about that on the way home, and the more she thought about it, the more something shifted in her. Not from fear toward courage exactly, because courage was a word she'd always found slightly performative. What shifted was more specific than that. She had spent a long time being careful about not drawing attention to herself. She had spent a long time making herself small, making herself manageable, making herself something that wouldn't cost other people anything. And the result of all that carefulness was that Harlan Vane had walked through every room she'd tried to seal against him and was standing now in the valley below this mountain, spreading lies about her to people who had never met her, using her silence as both his weapon and his protection. She was done being quiet about it. "I want to go to Millerton," she said. Elias looked at her. "When?" "As soon as the road's clear enough. I want to find Ida Pressler myself. Grint's inquiry hasn't moved in 2 weeks. I don't think he knows how to approach a woman in her position. I do." "Clara, I'm not asking permission," she said. And then, because that had come out sharper than she'd intended, "I'm telling you what I'm thinking. You can tell me if you think it's wrong." He was quiet for a moment, negotiating something internally. "It's not wrong," he said. "It's just a long ride and you'd have to go through Vane's territory to get there." "I know. I'll come with you. You have 9 children and a ranch. Thomas can manage for 3 days. He's been waiting to manage for 3 days for about 2 years now. He'll be fine." Elias looked at the road ahead. "You're not going to Millerton alone, Clara. That's not negotiable." She looked at his profile. The jaw that had gone firm in the particular way it went firm when he'd decided something. And she understood that this was one of the places where pressing would cost more than it gained. "All right," she said. 3 days." They left on a Thursday, early, with Hannah in charge of the household, and Thomas trying not to look too visibly satisfied about his temporary authority. The road down from the mountain was muddy but passable, and the Belhaven-Millerton road was better than Clara had feared. They stopped at Grint's office on the way through Belhaven to collect the one useful thing his inquiry had produced: a name. A man named Porter Quill, who'd been a clerk at the Millerton School Board at the time Clara was employed there, who Grint believed had left his position under circumstances that were also connected to Harlan Vane. "He's running a dry goods store in a town called Saxton now," Grint said, 12 miles east of Millerton. "He might talk." "Might," Clara said. "It's more than we had last week." Millerton was a town that had grown faster than it had planned to, with the particular disordered quality of frontier commerce, buildings still raw from construction beside established structures that had been there 20 years, the smell of lumber and livestock and industry all mixed together. Clara had lived here for 2 years, and it looked to her now like a place she'd dreamed once, and was seen again from the outside, recognizable, but foreign. Vane's offices were on the main street. They didn't stop there. They went to the address Grint had for Ida Pressler, which was a boarding house on the east side of town. The woman who answered the door said that Ida Pressler had moved out 6 months ago. She thought she'd gone to live with a sister somewhere north. She wasn't sure where. Clara stood on the boarding house steps in the March afternoon and absorbed this. "One of the two," Elias said from behind her. "Saxton," she said. They stayed the night in Millerton at a respectable hotel and spoke to no one they didn't need to speak to, and in the morning they drove 12 miles east to Saxton, which was smaller and quieter than Millerton and smelled of pine sap from the mill at its edge. Porter Quill's dry goods store was on the main street, modest and clean, with a hand-painted sign. The man behind the counter was maybe 45, thin, with careful eyes behind wire-framed glasses. He looked at Clara when she came in, and something moved in his expression, recognition, or the edge of it. "You're Clara Ashford," he said. It wasn't a question. "I am," she said. "You know who I am?" "Grint's letter came 3 days ago." He looked at Elias, then back at her. "I've been thinking about whether to talk to you. What did you decide?" He was quiet for a moment, arranging something on the counter that didn't need arranging. "Vane had me removed from the board position," he said. 2 years ago. He told the chairman I'd been mishandling the budget. I hadn't been. But I couldn't prove it cleanly enough to save my job, and Vane could make things very uncomfortable for people who stood against him. He looked at his hands. I should have said something at the time. I didn't. "What do you know about what he's doing now?" Clara asked. "I know he filed a formal complaint with the Millerton School Board last fall, retroactive, claiming there were financial irregularities in the record-keeping during your tenure there." "There were no financial irregularities." "I know that. I was the one keeping those records." He looked at her. He didn't need there to be real irregularities. He needed there to be a document with your name on it and the word complaint in the title. That's all. Something official-looking that he could show to people if he needed to discredit you. Clara felt the shape of it settle into place. the full architecture of what Vane had been building, carefully, over months. The letter to Farwell destroying her marriage prospect. The retroactive complaint creating a paper record of professional wrongdoing. The stories distributed through Farwell's men giving the rumors social reality. All of it designed not to take her to court, where he'd have to prove things, but to make her life in any community impossible. "Will you give a statement?" she said, attesting to the actual state of the financial records during my tenure and to the nature of Vane's complaint. Porter Quill looked at her for a long time. "He'll come after me again," he said. "Probably," she said. "I'm not going to lie to you about that. You're asking me to take on a man who has more money and more connections than I do on behalf of a woman I've never met, in a fight that isn't mine." "Yes," she said. "I am." He was quiet. He straightened the counter display again. "My wife," he said finally. "She knew you. She was on the parent committee at the school. She used to talk about a teacher there who was patient with her daughter, who had trouble keeping up." He looked up at Clara. "I used to think I'd do the right thing if it cost me something. Then it cost me something and I didn't. It's been bothering me since." "Mr. Quill," Elias said quietly, "we're not here to make you feel obligated. We're here because you know the truth, and we need someone who knows it to be willing to say it." Quill looked at Elias, then back at Clara. "I'll give you the statement," he said, "and I'll write to 2 other men who left Vane's circle under similar circumstances. I can't promise they'll respond, but they know things too." They had lunch at the only eating establishment in Saxton, a rough counter in the back of the hotel, and Clara ate without tasting it and thought about the statement in her satchel and what it actually meant. It was one piece. It was a good piece, but it was one. Vane had money and connections and 2 years of preparation. She had a dry goods store clerk and a lawyer who was trying his best and a set of reference letters she'd been carrying for 3 years. "I keep thinking about what Grint said," she told Elias, "about defense being the wrong posture." "What's the right posture?" "I don't know yet." She moved the food around her plate. "He's been controlling the story because he started it before I knew there was a story to be told. I need to change that." "How?" She thought about it. "Farwell," she said. "Farwell is the weak link in this. He's distributing Vane's story, but he didn't create it, which means he can be separated from it. If someone talks to Farwell, someone credible, someone in this community, and explains what Vane actually is and what he's doing, Farwell might stop." "Farwell doesn't like me much," Elias said. "No, but Gus Calloway knows him, and Gus is the kind of person Farwell respects." She looked across the table. If Gus understood what Vane is, what he did, what he tried to do, would he talk to Farwell? "Yes," Elias said, without hesitation. "Gus is a fair man. He doesn't like being used." They drove back to Belhaven the next day with the afternoon light making long shadows across the road, and Clara sat beside Elias with the statement from Porter Quill in her satchel and the beginnings of something she was cautiously allowing herself to call a strategy. It wasn't much, but it was more than she'd had a week ago, and she had learned over the last 4 years that more than you had a week ago was sometimes enough to build on. When they came through Belhaven, she went to Gus Calloway's trading post alone, while Elias waited with the horses. Gus listened to her without interrupting. She told him the full version this time, everything, including the evening at Vane's house and the nature of his interest and what had happened when she refused it. She told him about Porter Quill and the false complaint and the way the whole operation had been put together. She told him about Farwell and how she believed he was being used. When she finished, Gus was quiet for a moment. He looked at the counter. "Vane did something similar to a man in Red Rock 4 years ago," he said. "A land dispute. The other man ended up leaving the county." He looked up at her. "I didn't know he was connected to your situation until just now." "Will you talk to Farwell?" "Yes," he said without hesitation, which was the same tone Elias had used, and the similarity struck her. "I'll talk to him today." She walked back to where Elias was waiting with the horses. He looked at her. "Well?" he said. "Gus will talk to him." Elias nodded. He handed her the reins of her horse, and they mounted up for the last stretch of road home, the mountain rising ahead of them, with the late afternoon sun turning the snow on the high peaks to something close to gold. What happened over the next 3 weeks was not dramatic in the way that stories are dramatic. It was slow and unglamorous and involved a lot of conversations that Clara wasn't present for, and a letter-writing campaign conducted from Grint's office that she was present for, and two more witnesses who came forward in response to Porter Quill's letters, a former business associate of Vane's who had his own grievances, and a woman from Millerton who had heard about Clara's situation through channels Clara couldn't fully trace, and who wrote simply that she had information about Harlan Vane's character that she was willing to provide if it would help. Gus Calloway talked to Douglas Farwell, and whatever he said, Clara never learned the specifics. Farwell went quiet. His men stopped distributing the stories. Farwell himself was seen having a long conversation with Gus at the trading post on a Saturday morning, and afterward he looked, by all accounts, like a man who has been made to understand that he's been carrying someone else's water and is not pleased about it. Vane sent another letter in mid-April. This one was less elegant than the first, more pointed, more specific, which Grint said was a sign that he'd learned they were building a case and was trying to create pressure before it was complete. The letter alleged that Clara was guilty of misrepresentation in her correspondence with Douglas Farwell, and that she had concealed material information, meaning her inability to bear children, in a fraudulent attempt to secure a marriage. Clara read this letter standing in Grint's office and felt something she recognized as anger in its cleanest form. Not hot and reactive, but cold and very precise. "He's shifting targets," Grint said. "The professional complaint isn't going to hold. He knows we have Quill, so now he's trying a different angle." "Can he make this one stick?" Elias asked. "Concealing medical information isn't fraud in any legal sense I know of," Grint said. "But that's not really the point, is it? The point is to put the idea in people's minds, to make her look dishonest." "I wrote to Farwell," Clara said, "before I came here. I told him I would discuss certain personal matters in person. I have copies of those letters." She looked at Grint. "It's not concealment. It's a statement of intent that I followed through on." Grint looked at her. "You have copies of all your correspondence with Farwell?" "I make copies of important correspondence. I've done it since my husband died." She opened her satchel. "I have everything from the first letter onward." This time Grint's expression moved into something that was unambiguously impressed. "Miss Ashford," he said, "you might have been a lawyer." "I considered it," she said. "The options were limited." She went back to the homestead that evening and helped with supper and listened to Ruth describe an altercation at school that had apparently involved a disputed ownership of a hair ribbon, and helped little Cora with her boots, and sat with Michael in the rocking chair for 20 minutes while he fell asleep. And when she put him in his crib, she stood for a moment looking at him in the dim evening light and thought about everything that was at stake. Not just her reputation, not just her position. The children were at stake. Their stability, the life they'd built over the winter, the sense of safety that 9 kids who'd lost their mother had very slowly and unevenly started to feel again. All of that was attached to Clara being here. And Clara being here was attached to her reputation surviving what Harlan Vane was doing to it. And she was fighting a man with more resources and longer preparation and none of the costs that she was carrying. Hannah found her there in the dim room. "Is Michael asleep?" Hannah asked, quiet. "Finally." Clara turned from the crib. "He fought it tonight." Hannah leaned in the doorway looking at her younger brother and then at Clara with the look she'd developed over the winter. Still watchful, but different now, the suspicion replaced by something more complicated. "I heard what's happening," Hannah said. "In town. I hear things at school." She paused. "Is it bad?" "It's manageable," Clara said. "That's not the same as not bad." "No," Clara agreed. "It's not." Hannah was quiet. Then, "Those women who came before you, the other housekeepers, the ones who left, they left partly because of things people said. I know that now. I didn't really understand it then." She picked at the door frame with one thumbnail. "I used to think it was because we were too much. Too many of us, too difficult." "It wasn't that," Clara said. "I know, but it felt like that." She looked up. "I don't want you to leave because of what people are saying. I want to say that. Papa won't say it because he doesn't say things like that easily, but I can." Clara looked at her. 16 years old, standing in the doorway of the room where her baby brother slept, more certain than she'd been in October and still carrying the same deep wariness underneath. "I'm not planning to leave," Clara said. What if it gets worse? What if Vane... Hannah. Clara moved to the door, standing near enough that this was a conversation and not a distance. I have been pushed off a porch, stranded in a mountain storm, talked about in ways that were meant to make me disappear, and threatened by a man who thinks money is the same as power. I have not disappeared yet. She said it quietly, without heat. I don't intend to start now. Hannah looked at her for a long moment. Okay, she said. Just that. Okay, Clara agreed. She went to bed that night and lay in the dark listening to the house. And she thought about Harlan Vane, and about Porter Quill, and about the letters in her satchel, and about what Grint was going to file with the county court in the morning. She thought about Douglas Farwell on his porch in October, and the men at the fence who'd stopped working to watch. She thought about the storm that had come down from the mountain that same afternoon, and the sycamore tree she'd sat under, and what she'd felt under that tree, which was a certainty that everything was over. She had been wrong about that. The storm hadn't been the end of anything. It had been the road. She was still on it. Outside her window, the April dark held the mountain in silence, and somewhere down the hall Michael made the small, content sound he sometimes made in sleep, and the house breathed around her, and she did not feel afraid. She felt, if she was honest about it, something closer to ready. Grint filed the response with the county court on a Monday morning in late April, and by Tuesday afternoon, Harlan Vane's lawyer, a man named Aldous Creech, who practiced out of a large office in Millerton and had the particular groomed confidence of someone paid to be confident, had sent a counterfiling that was, as Grint put it when he read it, aggressive in ways that suggested his client was feeling the pressure. He's not retreating, Grint said, spreading the documents across his desk. He's escalating. That's actually a good sign. How is escalation a good sign? Clara asked. Because men with solid positions don't escalate. They wait. Escalation means he's looked at what we've built and decided he needs to move before we finish building it. Grint ran his finger down the filing. He's now claiming damages, claiming that your presence at the Mercer homestead has damaged his reputation by association, that you've been spreading false statements about his character. Clara read that section twice. He's claiming I damaged his reputation. Yes. She set the paper down carefully. He sent a letter to my prospective husband alleging I was medically defective. He filed a false professional complaint with a school board. He distributed fabricated stories about my history through a third party in this county. And he is claiming I damaged his reputation. That's correct? She looked at Elias, who was sitting beside her with his hat on his knee and an expression that had gone very still in the way it went still when he was controlling something. Can he win that claim? Elias asked. Not on the merits, Grint said. But winning isn't necessarily the point. Every filing costs time and money to answer. He may be trying to exhaust your resources before the original matter reaches a hearing. He paused. I want to be honest with you both. The counterfiling changes the timeline. We're looking at months, not weeks. Clara looked at the window. Outside, Bellhaven was doing its mid-morning business. Wagons on the street, someone arguing cheerfully in the alley beside the grain exchange. The ordinary, noisy motion of a functioning town. She thought about months. She thought about what months meant for the homestead, for the children, for the particular fragile thing that had been growing through the winter and into the spring. What do we do in this meantime? She said. We keep building the record. The woman from Millerton who wrote about Vane's character. I need her statement formalized. And Quill mentioned a second former associate. We need him too. Grint folded his hands. And I think, given the damages claim, we may need to be prepared to appear at a formal hearing and present everything we have in front of a judge. She had been prepared for that in the abstract. Hearing it said plainly still landed differently than the abstract. All right, she said. They drove back up the mountain in the early afternoon. The spring was serious now. Wildflowers on the lower slopes, the creek running high and cold with snowmelt, the aspen leafed out in that particular pale green that only lasted a few weeks before deepening. Clara watched all of it and thought about nothing very specific and everything at once, which was a state she'd been in frequently over the last month, and which she was learning, slowly, to sit inside without it pulling her under. It was that evening, after supper, after the younger children were in bed and Hannah and Thomas had retreated to do their own things, that Elias asked her to come sit on the porch. It wasn't warm yet, not really, but it was the kind of evening where the cold was bearable if you had a coat, and the sky to the west was doing something extraordinary with the last of the light. Long bands of color that she didn't have good words for, orange fading into something almost green at the horizon, the mountains going dark against it. They sat in the 2 chairs on the porch that had been there since she arrived, and that she'd never sat in before now. Not like this, not just to sit. Elias had his hands around a cup of coffee that had probably gone cold. He was looking at the sky. "I've been thinking about something," he said. "What?" He was quiet for a moment, not hesitating exactly. He didn't hesitate in the way of someone unsure what they want to say. More like he was choosing the right version of something he'd already decided. "I've been thinking about what we're doing," he said. "You and me, what we've been doing all winter." Clara kept her eyes on the sky. Keeping 9 children alive through a mountain winter. That too. He almost smiled. That's not what I mean." He turned the cup in his hands. "You know what I mean." She did know. She'd known it for a while. The way things between them had been shifting, gradually, in the way of something that had been moving toward a different shape since October and was now very nearly there. She'd been watching it happen from a careful distance, not naming it, not pushing it, letting it find its own pace. "Elias," she said carefully, "whatever you're thinking about saying, I want you to be sure you're saying it because it's true. Not because of Vane and the court filing and feeling like you need to protect something." He looked at her directly. "Those aren't the same thing?" "They might feel like the same thing right now. They're not." He was quiet for a moment, and she appreciated that he took it seriously rather than just reassuring her quickly. That was something she'd come to rely on, the fact that he didn't say things fast. He thought first. "Before Vane's first letter came," he said, "in February, when we were sitting at the kitchen table with the ranch accounts, what were you thinking when you went to bed that night?" She looked at the sky. The colors were fading now, the horizon going a deep, clear blue. "I was thinking I was further in than I'd planned to be," she said. "Further in how?" "Further in—" She stopped, started again. "I was thinking that I'd come here telling myself I was being practical, that I was making a reasonable decision under difficult circumstances. And sitting at that table, I had to admit to myself that it had stopped being only practical at some point, and I wasn't sure exactly when." He nodded slowly. "For me, it was earlier than that," he said. "It was the morning in December when Ben read that first sentence, and I saw your face." She turned to look at him. "You look like someone who'd just been given something back," he said. "Something they'd given up on. And I thought—" He stopped. He looked at his coffee cup. "I thought, I want to be in a life that has that in it, whatever that is, however it's supposed to work." She didn't say anything. The sky was almost dark now, the first stars appearing above the mountain ridge. "I'm not good at this," he said. "I want to be clear about that. I was married for 12 years and I still wasn't very good at saying things. Margaret used to tell me I communicated in weather patterns, that you could tell what I was thinking by whether I came in from the barn early or late." Clara looked at him. She wasn't wrong. He looked surprised, and then he laughed. A real one, quiet and brief, but real. And she felt the tension of the evening shift slightly into something more like the ordinary temperature of being with him. "No," he said. She wasn't. He set down the cup. "Clara, I'm asking you to marry me. That's what I'm trying to say. Not because of Vane, and not to solve a legal problem, and not because it would help the children, although it would, and not because I feel like you need rescuing, because I've watched you the last month and rescuing is not something you appear to need." He looked at her with that direct, unornamented attention that was so specifically his. "Because you are already the person this family turns to. Because I want you here for reasons that are mine, not reasons that are practical. Because when I try to picture the next 10 years without you at that kitchen table, I find I can't do it, and I've stopped wanting to try." She was quiet for a moment. She thought about what she'd told herself in October, under the sycamore tree, that it was too fragile to name, too new to trust. She thought about the careful distance she'd kept from her own feelings all winter, the way she'd categorized and set aside and deferred. She thought about Hannah's voice saying, "I don't want you to leave," and Michael raising his arms to be picked up, and Ruth and the dead bird in the frozen ground, and Thomas's shirt with the buttons. She thought about Elias at the kitchen table with the ranch accounts, saying better than most. She was 31 years old. She had 2 trunks and a satchel, and $41 when she came here, and she had the same 2 trunks now, but the satchel had a court filing in it, and the $41 had been absorbed into the general economy of the household months ago. And she was a woman who had been told she would not have children of her own, and who had spent the last 7 months up to her elbows in 9 of someone else's. "You know I can't," she started. "I know," he said. "I've known since February. You didn't tell me directly, but I put it together. It doesn't change anything I just said." "It changes things practically. We have 9 children, Clara. Practically is handled." She looked at him. The porch was dim now, the sky fully dark, the stars brilliant in the mountain air the way they only get above a certain altitude. The cold had come down properly, and she could feel it at the edges of the coat. "Yes," she said. He looked at her. "Yes." "Yes," she said again. "I'll marry you." He was quiet for a moment. He wasn't a man who expressed things in obvious ways, and he didn't now. He didn't make a large gesture of it, or say something that would have sounded wrong coming from him. What he did was reach across the space between the 2 chairs and put his hand over hers, and he left it there. And that was enough. It was exactly enough. They sat on the porch in the cold and the dark for a while longer, not talking much, and below the mountain the valley was a scattering of distant lights, and above it the sky was enormous and present, and inside the house 9 children slept in the ordinary faith of children who believe the morning will come. Thomas found out first, because Thomas was always up before everyone else, and he came into the kitchen the next morning to find Clara making biscuits with a posture that was, he apparently decided, different from her usual posture. Or perhaps Elias had already told him. Clara was never entirely sure. He stood in the kitchen doorway for a moment. "So you're staying," he said. "Yes," Clara said. "I'm staying." He nodded. He picked up the coffee pot and poured himself a cup. He'd started drinking coffee in February, and she'd decided not to comment on it. And he leaned against the counter. "Papa told me this morning," he said, "before you ask." "I wasn't going to ask. He said he was going to tell Hannah next, and then all of them together." He drank the coffee. "Hannah's going to cry." "Probably." "She cries when she's happy. She pretends she doesn't, but she does." He was quiet for a moment. "I cried when my mother died, and I haven't cried since. I don't know if that's right." She looked at him, 14 years old, trying to be a man, working out which parts of being a man were worth keeping and which weren't. "Crying when your mother died seems about right to me," she said. "I just don't want you to think—" He stopped. He looked at his coffee. "I don't want you to think I'm glad she's gone, because you're here." "Thomas, of course not. I know you're not her. I'm not confused about that. I know you're not." He looked up at her. There was something in his face that was younger than he usually let himself look. "Is it okay?" he said. "That I think it's good? That you're staying?" She held his gaze steadily. "It's more than okay," she said. "It's the best thing anyone said to me in a long time." Hannah did cry, briefly, and then was fiercely embarrassed about it, and Ruth cheered in a way that startled the chickens outside, and James pretended to be unaffected and was visibly not, and the 4 youngest received the news with varying degrees of comprehension, little Cora's primary response being to ask whether there would be cake. "Eventually," Clara told her. "Today?" "Not today." Cora considered this. "Okay," she said, with the philosophical resignation of a 5-year-old who has learned that adults have inexplicable timelines. The wedding was small and quick, because they were practical people with a court filing pending and a ranch to run, and 9 children who needed to eat. Gus Calloway was there, and his wife Netta, and Horace Grint, and a neighbor from 2 miles down the mountain named Vera Stills, who had brought the Mercer children eggs through the worst of the winter, and who cried more thoroughly than anyone else at the ceremony. Elias's ring didn't fit quite right. It had been his mother's, resized imperfectly. Clara wore it anyway. There was no honeymoon, because there were 9 children and a court filing and spring planting, and that was the nature of the life she'd chosen, and she found that she was not sorry about any of it. The hearing was set for the 2nd week of May, in the county court in Belhaven, before a judge named Emmett Tarbell, who Grint described as thorough, fair, and without particular patience for people who wasted his time. In the 2 weeks between the wedding and the hearing, several things happened. The woman from Millerton, her name was Agnes Pryor, and she turned out to be a former schoolteacher herself, which Clara found quietly satisfying, arrived in Belhaven with a written statement and the bearing of someone who had made a decision and was not going to be talked out of it. Her statement described 2 incidents involving Harlan Vane and women in his employ, neither of which had ever been formally reported, for the reasons that women in that era had for not reporting such things. The second former associate of Vane's that Porter Quill had written to, a man named James Bellard, who'd had a land dispute with Vane 4 years earlier, sent a deposition by mail from his current address in another county. His account of Vane's business methods was detailed and specific and included a description of how Vane had used false documentation in the land dispute to discredit the previous owner of a parcel he'd wanted. And Douglas Farwell, in a development that Clara had not anticipated, sent a letter to Grint's office. It was a short letter, written in the blunt, self-conscious way of a man who is not used to admitting things about himself. He wrote that he had been made aware that statements circulating under his name had originated from information provided to him by a third party, and that he was no longer willing to stand behind those statements, and that if his account of events was needed in any legal proceeding, he was prepared to give it. Clara read Farwell's letter twice, and then she set it down and sat with it for a while. She did not feel triumphant. That surprised her. She'd expected to feel something sharper, something like satisfaction at the sight of Farwell removing himself from the machinery Vane had built. What she felt instead was more complicated. Something close to tired and something close to sad. And underneath that, a strange sympathy that she hadn't earned and hadn't expected. Farwell was a man who'd made bad decisions from a defensible position. He'd been grieving something too, she thought. The version of the future he'd planned, the clean resolution he'd wanted, the heir who hadn't materialized in a wife he couldn't keep. Vane had found that wound and put something in it, and Farwell had let him, and now here was the letter. She showed it to Elias that evening. He read it and handed it back to her. "What do you want to do with it?" he asked. "Give it to Grint," she said. "It's evidence." "And after?" She looked at the letter. "After, I don't plan to think about Douglas Farwell very much." The morning of the hearing, Clara woke before dawn and lay in the dark for a while listening to the house. Elias was asleep beside her. That was still new enough that she was aware of it, the simple fact of another person's warmth and breath in the room. Outside, the Maydark was cool and smelled of rain, and the mountain was quiet. She thought about the sycamore tree. She thought about the October afternoon under it, her back against the bark, and the storm coming down, and the specific weight of believing that everything was finished. She thought about what she'd felt there, the things she'd let herself feel before she got up and went back into Calloway's and asked Gus if anyone needed help. She'd been so certain it was over. She'd been wrong about that in every direction. She got up before Elias woke and made coffee and sat at the kitchen table alone for 20 minutes, which was something she'd done every morning since arriving here and which she had no intention of stopping. This table had been the site of ranch accounts and homework and 3 children simultaneously needing things, and the conversation that had changed everything. She was attached to it in a way that was slightly unreasonable and entirely real. Hannah came down early too. She appeared in the kitchen doorway in the blue pre-dawn light and looked at Clara. "Couldn't sleep either?" Hannah said. "I slept," Clara said, just not long." Hannah poured herself coffee and sat across from her. She'd started drinking it in February, about 2 weeks after Thomas, which Clara had also not commented on. "Are you nervous?" Hannah asked. "A little." "What happens if it goes wrong?" Clara looked at her. It was a genuine question. Hannah asked genuine questions now, not the testing ones from October. There was a difference in the texture of them. "If it goes wrong, we appeal," Clara said. "And if that goes wrong, we look at other options. Vane has been building this for 2 years, and all he's managed to do is slow things down. He hasn't stopped anything." "He tried to." "He did try. He didn't succeed." She drank her coffee. "The thing about men like Vane is that they're very effective at making people disappear by convincing them to disappear themselves. The threat is usually more powerful than what's actually behind it." She looked at the table. "I almost disappeared. A few times. But you didn't. But I didn't. Hannah was quiet. The kitchen was beginning to lighten as the dawn came up outside, the particular slow gray light of early May filling the windows. I'm glad you didn't, Hannah said, simply, not as an observation, but as a statement of something she'd been carrying. I know, Clara said. So am I. The county courthouse in Belhaven was a two-story building that smelled of old wood and lamp oil and the particular weight of official proceedings. Judge Emmett Tarbell was exactly as Grint had described, thorough, fair, and visibly impatient with anything that wasted his time. He was also, it turned out, familiar with Harlan Vane's legal representative, Aldous Creech, in the way a judge becomes familiar with a lawyer who appears before him regularly and has not always covered himself in distinction. Vane was present. She had not seen him in 3 years. He was the same, well-dressed, controlled, with that quality of confident ease that she now recognized as the surface of something much less stable. He didn't look at her directly when she came in. He looked at the room in the way of a man assessing a situation and finding it slightly different than he'd expected. She looked at him directly. She had decided she would do that. She was done with the practice of making herself smaller when he was in a room. What happened over the next 4 hours was not the dramatic reversal of a story where truth arrives like weather, and everything changes in a moment. It was methodical and sometimes tedious, and required a great deal of patience from everyone involved except Judge Tarbell, who appeared to have replaced patience with precision and found it worked better. Grint presented the documentation in sequence. Clara's original employment records from Millerton, her letters of reference, the copies of her correspondence with Douglas Farwell, Porter Quill's statement, James Bellard's deposition, Agnes Pryor's formal account. He presented them without theatrics, in the flat, careful language of legal proceedings. And the picture they assembled was not of a woman who had fabricated her history, but of a man who had spent 2 years fabricating it for her. Creech challenged each piece. He was skilled at it. He knew how to suggest alternative interpretations, how to question the motives of witnesses, how to make the straightforward look complicated. Clara sat at the table and listened to her own life being argued about in legal language and felt the strange dissociation of it, the way the documented version of a person was both them and not them at the same time. When Farwell's letter was introduced, Creech objected to its admissibility, arguing that it was not a sworn statement. Tarbell overruled him with the brevity of a man who had already made up his mind about something. Vane took the stand himself, mid-afternoon, which his lawyer had apparently advised against. Claire could see it in the careful blankness of Creech's expression, the look of a professional man managing the consequences of a client who believed in his own persuasiveness. Vane was smooth on the stand, as he was smooth in all things. He answered questions with the patient, slightly injured air of someone who couldn't quite believe he was being subjected to this. He denied the substance of Agnes Pryor's account. He characterized his complaint to the Millerton School Board as a matter of genuine professional concern, not personal motivation. He spoke of Clara with a kind of sorrowful regret, as if she were a woman who had been troubled and he had tried, unsuccessfully, to help. She had expected this. Knowing something will happen doesn't always make it easier to sit through, but it makes it survivable. When Grint had the opportunity to cross-examine, he asked Vane only 3 questions. The first was about a specific date, the date of the school board complaint filing, and whether Vane could explain why the complaint was filed 11 months after Clara had left Millerton rather than at the time she left. The second was about the 2 employees named in Agnes Pryor's statement, and whether Vane could explain their departure from his household within 3 months of the relevant incidents. The third was about a letter that had not been in Grint's file until 2 days ago when Porter Quill had located it in his own records. A letter from Vane to the Millerton School Board chairman written 18 months before the formal complaint, making informal inquiries about whether certain information regarding a former teacher might be used to affect her future employment. Vane looked at that letter for a moment. Then he said he didn't recall the letter. Tarbell looked at the letter. He looked at Vane. He wrote something down. The ruling came the following morning, delivered in the flat official language of written decisions that somehow manages to contain everything that matters. The damages claim was dismissed entirely. The professional complaint was found to have originated in personal rather than professional motivation and to be without evidentiary support. The court noted that the pattern of conduct documented in the proceedings represented a sustained attempt to damage an individual's reputation and livelihood through coordinated false representations, and referred the matter to the county attorney for potential further action. It was not, Grint was careful to say, the end of everything. Vane could appeal. The county attorney might or might not act. The gossip that had spread through the valley would not be formally retracted by anyone, because gossip doesn't work that way. But the record existed now. It was real, and it was public, and it said, in the language of official things, what had actually happened. Elias was waiting outside the courthouse with the wagon. He looked at her face when she came out and read whatever he needed to read there. "Well," he said. "We won," she said. The words came out smaller than she'd expected, smaller and quieter, and not triumphant at all. More like the sound of something that had been held very tight for a long time slowly releasing. He put his arm around her, right there on the courthouse steps in Belhaven, where anyone might see, and she leaned against him for a moment and let it be over, or as over as it was going to be for now. "Can we go home?" she said. "Yes," he said. "We can go home." She was quiet on the ride back. Elias let her be quiet, which was one of the things she'd come to understand about him. He knew the difference between a silence that needed filling and one that needed leaving alone, and he mostly left the right ones alone. The May afternoon was warm and clear, and the road home wound up through country that was as beautiful as it had ever been, the new green of the mountain slopes pressing right up against the sky. She thought about the word home and how she'd been careful with it all winter, how she'd refused to let herself use it until she was sure she'd earned the right. She thought about when exactly that had changed, when she'd stopped being careful about it. She wasn't sure she could locate the exact moment. It had happened the way most real things happened, gradually, without announcement, and by the time she noticed it had been true for a while already. The children were waiting at the house when they came up the road. Not in a formal line, more of a general accumulation on and around the porch, the younger ones having apparently given up on waiting inside. Little Cora sitting on the top step with her chin in her hands, in the posture of someone who has been patient for a very long time and is making sure everyone knows it. Thomas was leaning against the porch post trying to look casual and failing completely. Hannah was standing just inside the door. Clara got down from the wagon and walked toward the house, and Cora came off the steps at a run and crashed into her at approximately knee height, which was normal. And Clara caught her and picked her up and carried her the rest of the way to the porch, with Cora's arms around her neck and the warm, solid weight of a 5-year-old who has decided where she belongs. "Well," Thomas said. "We won," Clara said. Ruth made the sound she'd made on the morning of the wedding, the one that startled the chickens, and James said something that was partially obscured by Ruth, but appeared to be positive, and the 4 youngest began a general celebration that involved running in circles, which seemed right. Thomas looked at her. There was something in his face that he was controlling, that he'd gotten better at controlling over the winter, that was 17 kinds of feeling all at once. "Good," he said. "Just that." Hannah came out of the doorway. She looked at Clara for a long moment, and then she walked over and put her arms around her, briefly, firmly, the hug of someone who doesn't do it easily and means it more for that, and then stepped back. "I told you it would be all right," Hannah said. Clara looked at her. You did not tell me that. You asked if it was going to be bad." "I was being supportive in my way." "That's a very loose definition of supportive." "I've been working on it," Hannah said, and Clara laughed, and the sound of it startled her slightly because she hadn't heard herself laugh like that in, she wasn't sure how long. A while. Long enough that it felt like something that had come back rather than something ordinary. Elias came up behind her, and the children arranged themselves around them on the porch in the late afternoon light, and down the mountain the valley was green and gold, and the creek was running high with snowmelt, and the aspen stand behind the house was full of small leaves that caught the light and moved in it, and the sky above the peaks was the deep particular blue of a May afternoon at altitude, clear down to the bone. She stood on her porch and felt all of it. The weight of the last 7 months, the specific shape of how far she'd come, the distance between the woman under the sycamore tree who had believed everything was over and the woman standing here now with a 5-year-old on her hip and a husband beside her and 8 other children who were, in every way that mattered, hers. She was not going to call it smooth. She was not going to call it easy. There were still things that would be hard. There were hard things every day, the ordinary hard things of a large household and a mountain ranch, and there would be other difficulties she couldn't yet see. She did not have an idealized picture of what came next, but she had this: the porch, and the mountain, and the people on it. She had this, and it was enough. And it was real. And she had earned every difficult inch of it. The county attorney's investigation into Harlan Vane took 8 months, which was about as fast as such things moved in that country. And the result was not a dramatic courtroom scene with a verdict that satisfied every grievance. The result was quieter than that, and in some ways more complete. Vane settled 2 civil claims from former business associates, paid a substantial fine related to the fraudulent documentation in the Bellard land dispute, and resigned from the Millerton School Board Advisory Committee before he could be formally asked to leave. He did not go to prison. He did not lose everything. He remained a man with money and connections and the kind of social position that absorbs damage better than most, and Clara was honest with herself about the fact that justice in the real world tends to be partial rather than total. But his reach contracted. That was the word Grint used when he wrote to inform her of the settlement: contracted. The particular apparatus Vane had used to move through other people's lives, the network of obligations and connections and strategic information, had been exposed to enough light that people were less willing to stand in it with him. Some of the men who'd done business with him quietly shifted their dealings elsewhere. Agnes Pryor's statement, which had been part of the court record and therefore public, had been read by enough people in Millerton that the conversation there had changed. Porter Quill wrote to Clara in the fall. He said his dry goods store in Saxton was doing well. He said his wife had told him to write and thank her for giving him the occasion to do the right thing, which he described in his own words as something he'd needed more than he'd expected to. Clara wrote back and told him she was glad, and meant it, and she kept his letters in the same satchel she'd carried from Belhaven the previous October, the one that had started with $41 and a packet of tied letters and had since accumulated a different kind of weight. The first year of the marriage was not easy in the ways she'd anticipated, and not hard in the ways she'd feared. She had expected the children to be the difficult part. They were not, or not primarily. They were just children, which was to say they were sometimes wonderful and sometimes exhausting and almost never predictable, and she had enough experience with children to know that consistency was more valuable than perfection and presence was more valuable than either. What was actually difficult was the marriage itself, in the ordinary way of 2 people who had both been alone for a while, learning to be in the same life without losing the parts of themselves that had kept them functional while they were alone. Elias did, as his first wife had apparently observed, communicate in weather patterns. Clara learned to read them imperfectly, and she was wrong often enough to require actual conversation, which he found harder than she did, and she found harder than she wanted to admit. They had one serious argument in the first 6 months, about money, specifically about a decision he'd made about the cattle sale timing without consulting her, reverting to the old single October pattern rather than the split-season approach she'd identified in the accounts. He'd made the decision quickly, in a moment when prices looked favorable, and it had turned out to be the right call financially, which somehow made the argument worse rather than better, because the point was never whether it was the right call. The point, she said, standing in the kitchen with her arms crossed in a posture she recognized as not her best, is that we said we'd decide these things together. Not that you'd decide and tell me afterward. I told you the same day, he said. Yes, after. He looked at her. He had the expression he wore when he was doing the internal work of understanding something that hadn't come naturally to him. I've been making these decisions alone for 2 years, he said. Sometimes I forget. I know, she said. That's not a good enough reason. He was quiet for a moment. No, he said. It's not. He looked out the window. I'm sorry. She uncrossed her arms. It wasn't a spectacular apology. It was a real one, which was better. Next time you see the prices move, she said, you come find me first, even if I'm in the middle of something. Even if you're in the middle of homeschooling 4 children simultaneously? Especially then, I can do 2 things at once. He almost smiled. I've noticed that, he said. It was the kind of argument that sounds small when you describe it, and wasn't small when you were in it, and the resolution of it established something that held through the years afterward. Not that they stopped disagreeing, but that they'd agreed on how disagreement worked. This was, Clara thought, the unglamorous foundation of every lasting thing. Not the grand moments, but the small negotiations, the framework you build for handling the inevitable friction of two real people sharing a real life. Thomas turned 15 that summer and grew 2 inches and became, somewhere in the process, someone Clara looked at and saw not the guarded 14-year-old who'd carried wood into the kitchen as a reluctant peace offering, but an actual young man. Still rough-edged, still given to silences that could be misread, but present in a way he hadn't been before. He was working the ranch seriously now, learning cattle from Elias in the systematic way Elias taught things, which was by doing and explaining and not by lecturing. He was also, she noticed, watching how Elias treated her, watching how a man moved through a household where his opinion was not the only one that mattered. She thought about that sometimes, what it meant for Thomas to have that to watch, at 15, before the habits of a different model had time to calcify. Hannah left for the Valley School in September of that year, boarding with a family in Belhaven through the week to access a teacher who could prepare her for the examinations she needed. She was 17 and serious and frightened in a way she was trying not to show, and the morning she left, Clara stood on the porch and watched the wagon go down the road and felt something complicated, proud and sad, and aware of the specific shape of what it meant when the thing you've been trying to help someone become is capable of leaving. She'd written Hannah a letter which she'd given her the night before rather than the morning of, because the morning of was going to be hard enough without adding to it. The letter was not long. She'd said, "You are more capable than you know, and the people who told you otherwise were wrong, and being wrong about yourself is something you will do your whole life, and learning to correct it quickly is one of the most useful things a person can do." She'd said, "Write to me." She'd said, "The hardest part of leaving is the moment right before. It gets better once you're moving." Hannah had read the letter twice, standing in the kitchen, and then she'd folded it very carefully and put it in her coat pocket and said, in her controlled, even voice, "Thank you, Clara." And then she'd gone to her room, and Clara had heard, through the wall, a brief and private sound that she'd given Hannah the dignity of not acknowledging. The letter Hannah wrote back 2 weeks later said, "You were right about the moment right before." It said, "My roommate is from a farm south of here, and she's never met a woman who kept her own accounts, and I told her I had, and she didn't believe me." It said, "I think I'm going to like it here, but I miss Michael climbing on me in the mornings. Tell him to stop growing." Clara read that letter at the kitchen table, and Elias watched her face over his coffee. "Good?" he said. "Very good," she said. Ben learned to read, completely and fluently, by the end of his first winter. He was 8 years old when he read his first full page without stopping, and he looked up from the book with an expression that Clara had seen once before, on the morning of the 3-word sentence, and that had not diminished with repetition. If anything, it had concentrated the pleasure of a person discovering that a door they'd thought was locked is actually open. He became, over the following years, a reader of a particular obsessive intensity, and the challenge shifted from getting him to read to getting him to stop reading long enough to eat supper, which was a problem Clara had no complaints about. Ruth's arithmetic ability turned out to extend as the years progressed into something broader, a facility with numbers and patterns and the relationships between them that went past classroom work and into the realm of genuine aptitude. At 12, she was doing calculations for the ranch accounts. At 13, she was finding efficiencies in the feed purchasing that saved real money. Elias told her, with the straightforward honesty he applied to everything, that she had a mind that shouldn't be wasted on a ranch, and that when the time came, they would find a way to send her somewhere she could use it properly. Ruth looked at him like he'd said something unexpected, which it was. Not the sentiment, but the saying of it. "You mean a school?" she said. "Or whatever it is by then. Things change." He was looking at the accounts she'd been working through. "You want to keep doing this? The accounts?" "Yes," she said. "Is that strange?" "No," he said. "Your mother was good with numbers, too." Ruth was quiet for a moment. "She was?" "Very. Better than me." He turned a page. "Show me what you found in the October figures." Clara, who had been at the other end of the table and had not been pretending not to hear, went back to her own work and felt the particular warmth of a moment that hadn't needed her in it and was better for that. Cora turned 6 and started school in the valley. Michael turned 3 and then 4 and was everywhere simultaneously, with the specific energy of a child who had been raised by a committee and had decided this was his natural right. The homestead accumulated the evidence of years in the way that working properties do. Not deterioration, but sediment, the layering of seasons and work, and the decisions people make about what to keep and what to let go. The north pasture was cleared in the 2nd year, which they'd been meaning to do since Clara arrived. The fence line along the creek was rebuilt in the 3rd year, a project that took most of June and involved the older children in ways that were productive and the younger children in ways that were mostly enthusiastic. A root cellar was added to the east side of the barn in the 4th year, which Clara had wanted from the first winter, and which Elias had agreed was necessary, and which they'd worked toward in the methodical way they worked toward everything, identifying it, planning it, finding the labor and the money, doing it. The community in the valley had shifted too, in the gradual way communities shift when the story they've been carrying gets corrected. Gus Calloway had a great deal to do with this, because Gus was the kind of man whose opinion circulated through a community without him having to raise his voice, and his opinion of Clara, and of Elias, and of the homestead, and of the conduct of the whole affair, had been consistent and clear, and had been heard. Netta Calloway brought women to the homestead occasionally, women who were new to the territory, or who were in difficult circumstances, because word had spread in the particular way word spreads among women, carefully, through trusted channels, that there was a woman on the mountain who was practical and honest, and who would tell you what you needed to hear rather than what was easy. The first woman Clara sat with formally was named May Denton, who'd come to the territory as a mail-order bride and found herself in a situation that was considerably worse than the man's letters had suggested. She arrived at Calloway's trading post in late autumn of Clara's 2nd year of marriage, with one bag and a bruise she was trying to cover, and the specific combination of pride and desperation that Clara recognized from the inside. She didn't try to fix May Denton in a single conversation. She offered her the spare room that had been Hannah's for 6 weeks, and she gave her work that was dignified, and she told her plainly what options existed and what they cost and what they might lead to. May stayed for 2 months, and then went to her sister in another county with enough money saved to make the journey and a letter from Clara that she could show to any school board or employer that needed a character reference. She wrote to Clara for years afterward. So did others, eventually. Women who'd heard about the room above the Mercer Ranch kitchen, about the woman up there who'd been through something and hadn't pretended otherwise, and who would talk to you straight. Clara did not establish a formal arrangement. She did not have a plan or a mission or a name for what she was doing. She just kept doing it, the way she did most things, because there was a need, and she was there, and it was the reasonable thing. She talked to Elias about it one evening, the winter of the 3rd year, sitting at the kitchen table after the children were in bed, a configuration that had become as natural to her as breathing. "Does it bother you?" she asked. "The women who come." He was reading something, a seed catalog, she thought, or one of the farming publications he subscribed to. He looked up. "Why would it bother me? It changes things, the household. It wasn't part of what you signed up for, so to speak." He put down the catalog. "Clara, when I asked you to marry me, I said it was because you were already the heart of this family. The heart of a family doesn't have a boundary at the property line." She looked at him. "Besides," he said, picking the catalog back up, "May fixed the latch on the root cellar that I've been meaning to fix for 6 months. I'm not complaining." She laughed. He was right about the latch. The 5th year brought a dry summer that was hard on the cattle and harder on the relationships between ranchers in the valley. Because a dry summer means not enough water, and not enough water means decisions about who gets what. And decisions about resources between neighbors have a way of surfacing everything that was already strained. There were 2 disputes that season that came close to lasting damage and were resolved mostly through conversations that Elias was part of and that Clara sat in on at Elias's request. Not to speak for them, but because, as he told her, "You see things in rooms that I miss." She did see things. She'd been seeing things in rooms since she was a school teacher dealing with parents who were telling her one story with their words and a different one with every other part of them. She knew how to watch the space between what was said and what was meant. And she knew how to find the small opening where a different outcome was possible, and she used it, carefully, without making it visible. The summer ended. The cattle prices were reasonable in spite of the dry year. the disputes resolved without lasting damage. The homestead went into its fifth winter with full stores and an improved root cellar, and all 9 children accounted for. Hannah having come home from her second year of Valley School with better grades than the previous year, and a friend she'd made there who she spoke about with the particular care of someone protecting something new. One evening in December of that 5th year, Clara was in the barn finishing up a task that had run past dark. A lamb had been born early, and she'd been monitoring it through the afternoon. It was alive and doing better than she'd feared, and she was covering the small animal with extra straw when she heard footsteps and Thomas appeared in the lantern light, 17 now, and taller than his father by an inch that he was still getting used to. "Lamb okay?" he said. "Better," she said. "She's stubborn. I think she'll make it." He crouched down and looked at the lamb for a moment. "I've been thinking about something," he said. "What?" He was quiet in the way he still was sometimes, the remnant of the 14-year-old who'd carried wood in as a reluctant peace offering. "When I was 14, he said, "the first week you were here, I wasn't kind about it." "You were cautious," she said. "There's a difference." "I was rude, is what I was." Sometimes," she agreed. He looked at the lamb. "I want to say I'm sorry for that. I know it was a long time ago. I've been thinking about it, and I wanted to say it." She looked at him. This young man who had been a boy on a porch step watching her with his father's measuring expression, and who had become over 5 years of ordinary daily proximity, someone she loved with a specific and undramatic completeness that she couldn't have predicted from the outside. "Thomas," she said, "you were 14 years old and you'd lost your mother, and a strange woman showed up in your house. You were doing the best you could." Still, she agreed. "I accept the apology. For what it's worth, I think the caution made sense. I didn't know yet if I was going to stay either." He looked at her. "But you did." "I did." He was quiet for another moment, looking at the lamb. "I'm glad," he said. She didn't cry. She was by this point somewhat better at not crying than she'd been at 31, though not by as much as she might have hoped. She focused on the lamb and let the moment be what it was. And after a bit, Thomas stood up and helped her finish the straw, and they walked back to the house together in the December cold, their breath making brief clouds in the dark. Elias was at the kitchen table when they came in. He looked up and looked at them both with that attention he gave to things he found worth attending to. And he read whatever he needed to read and went back to what he was doing without comment, which was the right call. It was later that night, when the house was quiet, that Clara stood at the bedroom window for a while before sleeping and looked out at the mountain. The December sky was clear and enormous, the same sky it had always been up here, filled with stars that looked close enough to be a problem. The creek she could sometimes hear through the window was quiet now, frozen in the upper reaches and running slow below, and the aspen stand on the hill was bare for the season, the white trunk showing in the starlight. She thought about what she would tell herself, if she could tell herself anything. The woman under the sycamore tree in October, back straight, hands folded, $41, and a packet of letters, and the specific certainty that everything was finished. She'd thought about this before, and the honest answer was always the same. She wasn't sure the woman under the sycamore tree would have believed her. Some things don't resolve into lessons you can carry forward cleanly. Some things you just have to live through to the other side. And the only argument you can make to someone who is living through the middle is that other sides exist, which sounds like nothing when you're in the middle and is everything when you come out. What she knew, standing at the window in the December dark of her 5th winter here, was this. She had been rejected and she had survived it. She had been lied about, and she had answered the lies with the truth, which was slower and more expensive but worked better in the end. She had been told she was worth less than she was. By a doctor's flat verdict, by a man on a porch, by stories distributed through a valley by a man with money and old grievances. And she had spent 5 years building a daily argument against that verdict, not by proving anything to anyone, but by simply being present and being real and doing the next thing that needed doing. She had not had an easy life. She was not going to say she was glad for every hard thing, because she wasn't. She wasn't glad for the doctor's verdict, and she wasn't glad for the storm, and she wasn't glad for what Harlan Vane had done over 2 patient years. Those things had cost her real things. She was allowed to know that. But she was standing at this window, and down the hall 9 children slept. Well, 8 now, Hannah being in the valley and becoming whatever she was becoming. And Elias was behind her reading himself to sleep with the lamp still on, and the quiet of the room was the quiet of something real and present, not the quiet of absence, not the hollow kind. She thought about what it meant that the storm had led her here. Not in the way of a story where everything is arranged to produce a lesson. She was suspicious of that kind of story, the kind where suffering comes with a clean moral attached, where the hardship turns out to be preparation for the reward. That wasn't how it had worked. There was no plan visible to her, no design. There had been a storm and a washed-out road and a trading post and a man who mentioned a widower with 9 children who needed help. And she had made a choice, and then another choice, and then another one. The choices were the thing, not the storm. The choices she made inside the storm and after it. She was not irreplaceable in the sense that the word usually means, as though no one else could have come to this mountain and done what she did. Someone else might have. The children would have survived, probably, and found their way to something. She knew that. She wasn't the only possible version of this story, but she was the version that had happened. She had come, and she had stayed, and she had become the person that this particular family turned to, not because she was extraordinary, not because she was perfect, not because she had been chosen by some fate that knew better than she did, because she had shown up and kept showing up on days when it was difficult and days when it was ordinary, which it usually was, because most of life is ordinary, and the ordinary days are where everything actually gets built. In the spring of the 6th year, Hannah came home for the summer and announced, in the direct way she'd had since she was 16, that she intended to pursue a teaching certificate. She sat at the kitchen table and laid out her plan. The examinations she needed, the certification process, the schools she was considering, and she talked about it like someone who had thought it through and made her decision and was reporting rather than asking permission. Clara listened to all of it. She watched Hannah's face while she talked, the animation in it, the particular brightness of someone who has found the shape of what they want and recognized it. When Hannah finished, she looked at Clara. "What do you think?" she said. "I think you'd be a very good teacher," Clara said. "You're not objective." "No," Clara agreed. "But I've taught children for a long time, and I know what it takes, and I think you have it." She paused. "I also think you've known this was coming for a while, and the fact that you're saying it now means you're ready." Hannah looked at the table. "I kept thinking I needed to know for certain first, that I'd feel certain." "You won't feel certain," Clara said. "That feeling doesn't come before the decision. It comes after. Sometimes well after." Hannah was quiet. "Did you feel certain when you came here?" Clara thought about the wagon in the October mud and Elias's coat with the wrong color thread at the collar and the 9 faces behind Hannah in the doorway. "I felt practical," she said. "I thought I was making the most reasonable decision available under difficult circumstances. I had no idea what I was walking into. And now? Now I know what I was walking into." She looked at Hannah steadily. "And if I could go back and choose again, knowing everything, the winter, the court case, all of it, I'd choose the same thing." Hannah held her gaze for a moment. "Okay," she said. "Then I'm going to do it." "Yes," Clara said. "You are." Hannah left again in August, this time for a certification program 3 counties east. And this time the departure was different. Still hard, because departures are hard, but cleaner. She knew where she was going. She'd been away before. She and Clara stood on the porch in the August morning and said their goodbyes with the practical efficiency of 2 people who love each other well enough not to make the leaving worse than it has to be. "Right," Clara said. "I will. Don't let Michael eat the cat's food again. It gave him a terrible stomach last time. He doesn't listen to me on that subject. He doesn't listen to anyone on that subject." Hannah picked up her bag. "Clara?" "Yes?" A pause. Hannah had the expression she got when she was going to say something she'd been thinking about for a while. "I used to think I was the one keeping things together," she said, "after Mama died. I thought if I stopped, everything would fall apart. I held on to that for a long time." She looked out at the mountain road. "I don't think that anymore. I think things were very hard, and I was doing what I could, and then you came, and I didn't have to be the only one anymore." She looked back at Clara. "I think that's what you did. You didn't take over. You just made it so I wasn't alone in it." Clara didn't speak for a moment. That's all any of us can do for each other, she said. Show up and make the alone part smaller. Hannah nodded. She went down the steps and across the yard to the wagon where Elias was waiting to take her to the road, and Clara stood on the porch and watched her go with the August morning bright around her and the mountain standing solid above the tree line and the creek running below, and she thought, there she goes. There goes one of mine. That autumn, when the leaves had turned and the harvest was in, and the household had settled into the particular rhythm of October, Clara took out the packet of letters from her satchel. The letters Farwell had written her, tied with kitchen twine, the ones she'd been carrying since Belhaven. She'd kept them without knowing why, out of habit, out of the archivist instinct she'd developed after her husband died, and that had served her well in Grint's office. She read through them, sitting at the kitchen table on a Thursday afternoon when the children were at school and the house was quiet. They were good letters, honestly, careful and thoughtful and occasionally funny. She could see, reading them now, the version of the future she'd been building from them. She could see it clearly. She could also see, clearly, that it was smaller than what she had. She untied the twine. She put the letters in the stove. She watched them catch and then looked away, because there was nothing more to see, and she made herself a cup of coffee and sat at the table in the October afternoon and listened to the house around her, which was always full of something, sounds and smells, and the evidence of 9 people living their particular lives inside these walls. She thought, I almost didn't come up the mountain. She thought, I almost let the storm be the end of the story. She thought, what a thing it is to make a choice when you're afraid and have no guarantee of what's on the other side, and to find out later that the choice was exactly right. Elias came in from the barn sometime later, stomping mud from his boots at the door, and he looked at her at the table and he said, You're sitting with something. Was, she said. I think I'm done now. He poured himself coffee and sat across from her. He looked at the stove. Letters? He said. The ones from before. He was quiet for a moment. You all right? He said. She looked at the table. She looked at the rings on her hand, the imperfectly resized ring that still caught on things occasionally and that she'd stopped noticing somewhere in the second year. She looked at Elias across the kitchen table, which was where she had come to believe she could see him most clearly. Not in the grand moments, but in this one, ordinary and present, coffee going cold and mud on his boots and the lines on his face that were years of weather and work and the specific particular life of this man. Yes, she said. I'm very all right. Outside the window, the mountain held the October afternoon, the same mountain it had always been. Indifferent and enormous and beautiful in the way that severe things are beautiful, the way that anything is beautiful when you've learned to see it clearly instead of only fearing it. Below the tree line, the aspen had gone gold, the whole hillside gold, the kind of color that only lasts a week before the wind takes it. She had come here in October under a different set of aspens and believed everything was finished. She had been so wrong. The greatest thing about being wrong like that, the thing no one tells you when you're sitting under a storm-stripped sycamore tree with your back straight and your hands folded and your whole future apparently gone, is that you don't know yet how wrong you are. You're in the dark, and the dark is real, and the fear is real, and the loss is real. But somewhere above you, the road continues. And the question that matters isn't whether the road is safe or whether you know where it ends. The question is whether you're willing to get up and walk it. Clara Ashford had gotten up. Everything else followed from that.